So welcome, Kristina Ishmael, and you're at a new you're traveling across the country right now to
I
go to
am.
your new job, which is like so exciting.
Yeah.
And I think I've just your OER work and your culturally responsive work has been some of the stuff that I've been really following, and I'm really glad that you're able to come and talk with us today about sustainability of OER, creating OER, and then also that culturally responsive, because this is what you do.
Yeah. It is.
And so yes, and so on the agenda, you guys will notice I did link her slides, and also we have her stock photos. And do you have us a little backstory on the stock photos, because I love
Happy
them.
to. um, that actually lends itself to kind of my background here. So, as you mentioned, I have taken a new role with Open Education Global that doesn't officially start until the 22nd, but I will be their new director of primary and secondary education, which is what we call K-12 internationally. And so taking best practices and lessons learned, as well as professional development that I've been able to lead over the past 4 years globally. And so I'm excited to be starting that position in the coming weeks. Over the past 3 years, I've been with New America, which is a think tank and a civic enterprise out in DC, leading OER work. Prior to that, I was at the US Department of Education's Office of Ed Tech, leading Go Open, and then Nebraska Department of Education as their digital learning specialist. And that's where the stock photos actually come into play. So towards the end of my time at the state before I moved out to DC 4 years ago, we were in the process of developing e-learning courses, and we were using a program called Articulate Storyline to develop those courses. And all of the stock photos in there were of men and women in suits. And I said, this is not going to work for teachers. Like, this just doesn't resonate. And so we had hired a new multimedia person, and he was like, well, let's just recreate them. And so we were in the studio and pulled them up and went line by line. And I just recreated each kind of pose that they had, and they got them edited and put up in April 2016, and they've been downloaded an obscene amount of times since then. And one of the requirements that I asked of them was that they would openly license all of those. And so I get no royalties from my image being everywhere around the internet, but I believe in open, and so it supports all the work that I do. And I also get to be Easter eggs in people's presentations, or someone that sent me a Facebook message last night that was like, we were watching this YouTube video and your photo popped up. So it happens quite frequently, actually. It's fun to do a reverse Google image search and see myself in really random places. Not always places that I necessarily support, but that's part of it. So but I am also a former classroom teacher. I was early childhood and elementary teacher, working in preschool all the way up through sixth grade, and specifically with English learners in Omaha, Nebraska. So, and I'm thrilled to be here with you all today. I had the chance to participate in an event that was hosted in Rapid City last summer on customized learning, and we talked a lot about how OER can play a role in providing customized learning opportunities for our students. And so Julie and I connected, and then we got to see each other again at a librarian conference in Monterey, California, which is a terrible place to be, and talked about this specific group of librarians. So in my role at the state level in Nebraska, I was actually the school library liaison. For school accreditation purposes in Nebraska, they require a full-time school librarian for every 250 students. And so this is pretty much unheard of in a lot of other states. And I actually started an MLS program at one point, and school librarians have a special place in my heart. And so I've been able to really kind of lift up the work that they do in my work nationally, and talk about their role in curation of resources and how to leverage them in the process of curating as well as even selecting resources. And so it makes sense that you all are doing this work and want to talk about sustainability. Before I get into the actual sustainability, I did want to mention some of the things that we've been talking about kind of in ed policy world around the fall. And we obviously don't know a lot of things. There are still a lot of factors that we don't know, but we do have some potential scenarios. And so the CARES Act that was signed in early May allotted 13.5 billion for K-12 emergency relief funding. The majority of that's already been distributed through the government relief funds, as well as the the elementary and secondary education relief funds, also known as ESSERs, through the state education agencies. And so 10% was kept at the state level, and then 90% was distributed down to the district level. But there's also another category for competitive grants. And this is where they are calling on states to propose different types of learning opportunities for them to rethink K-12 education right now. And part of that is to support remote learning as well as the development of resources. And so if you are not familiar with this, I would strongly suggest getting familiar with this and advocating for the role of OER in all of this, because it is an opportunity for potential funds to come from the state or come from the federal to the state and support the development or curation of pre-existing resources and help kind of spread that across various states. Some colleagues and I also wrote a report that was released 2 weeks ago, and we talked about 4 different scenarios for the fall, and we entitled that Pandemic Planning for Distance Learning. It's a catchy title. But we didn't necessarily want to address traditional back-to-back or like back to school. People know what that looks like. We also know that there will be opportunities for folks to go back to school in traditional settings with different kind of staggered or track schedules. And so we kept those kind of aside and said, you all can figure that out with CDC recommendations as far as, you know, temperature scans and safely distancing student desks and all of that. But we did decide to focus on 4 different scenarios that would be important to include because of distance learning and kind of the inclusion of what we've been doing and in the crisis distance learning, but having more time to plan for that. And so we have Brick to Click, which is essentially going back in a traditional in-person setting. However, mirroring everything that we're doing in the classroom so that they could quickly pivot to online and have more of a planned response than we did in March. Click to Brick is actually starting online and making sure that all academic content is delivered online, but then at some point being able to come back in person when we are allowed to do so and what that might look like. So really digging into relationship building and trauma-informed practices and providing services for mental health and just social emotional learning. Then we have blended learning and online learning, which are definitely 2 more planned types of distance learning, where blended is, you know, very specifically planned, where they have 1 to 2 days in person, and then the rest of that is delivered online, and then online being 100% online. In all of these scenarios, it's really hard as a former early childhood and elementary teacher to think about this with our youngest learners and our most vulnerable populations, especially our ELs and students with disabilities. And we recognize that not all of these are going to work with our students that have the highest needs. But it is important to also start to think about and plan for the fall. And so I wanted to start with that and kind of the framing that we've been talking about in larger ed policy conversations, just so that you're aware of that. As far as sustainability and OER is concerned, I broke it down into a few things, and this is what I talk about a lot in the work that I do, but also hearing directly from districts that are doing this work. And so maintenance and funding, this is really what it comes down to when you want to talk about sustainability. So maintenance, this can be done in a number of ways. In most school systems, we see teams of teachers and librarians and district leaders that are working on this together so that it's not singletons and that it's not, the onus is not on one specific person, but that they are sharing the jobs and that they all have certain roles and responsibilities. So the frequency of reviewing resources is really important. I hear this most often when they're like, but we have broken links. And so the frequency that we're able to review the resources is really critical. Some districts are able to approach that on a monthly basis, on a quarterly basis, and they're just keeping track of the content that's being used. Then we also talk about the role of reviewing the resources. Who is going to review those resources? Is that going to be the responsibility of school librarians? Is that going to be the responsibility of the entire team, certain people within the team? And then the curation, organization, and management of resources. So when we first get started, we're doing the searching and the discovering of the resources, and that is through a variety of repositories and different places where those resources actually exist. But then we also have to curate and organize those. And so what is the mechanism that will be used for that? Will it be through a learning management system? Most school districts that I work with actually use Google in this, and they'll use Google Docs because it is a low barrier of entry for a lot of folks that either have G Suite or they might be using Microsoft for that purpose as well. But talking about who is going to not only curate the resources, but how is that going to be organized and managed? And then tips and tricks of reviewing resources. What does that look like when you are, as a school librarian, and you are training your teachers? What are some of the tips and tricks that you can build into that professional development opportunity? So that might involve media literacy opportunities. How do we know fact versus fiction? How do we know that this is a valid source in the time of a lot of misinformation and disinformation? How can we integrate some of those natural conversations into all of this? And then, of course, we get into funding. When I first joined the US Department of Education's Office of Ed Tech, we were really big on saying that it will save districts money, and quickly learned that that was not actually the case. It is a reallocation of the funds. And so it's important to know that from the district leaders that we've heard, they said, we did not eliminate that budget line item, but we had to reallocate that into something else. Some states don't allow that. I know North Carolina and Michigan, for example, don't allow funds that would traditionally be used for textbooks or instructional materials to be used for professional development, for anything else for that matter. And so it's also knowing the policies behind this, or it could be at the district level as well. We have title funds that are an option for all of this. When I was at OET, we did a lot of work on Title 4A under ESSA, and Title 4A is kind of bucketed into three different focus areas, and they are safe and secure schools, well-rounded schools, and ed tech. And we included OER in that ed tech piece because we wanted folks to realize that they could use potential title funds to help support their OER work. You can also use Title I funds and Title II funds, especially for the professional development. And then, of course, there are grant opportunities, whether they're from more local foundations or smaller grant opportunities, or something like your IMLS grant that helps support this work. There are always some of those grant opportunities that exist as well. So I'm going to stop talking for a moment. I'm going to have you all join me in the chat and do a quick write. What policies and procedures do you have in place to help support your sustainability of OER? I'm going to stop talking and join you all in the chat. Okay, so I see a lot of we have nothing in place. Okay. Laura, I hear that often. Most teachers don't know anything about OER. Okay, this is really helpful to know. For folks that are in, yes, and Julie's just saying in South Dakota, there are some districts that are doing this. So I know when we get smaller districts involved, when we get larger districts involved, that can help with some of our smaller districts, but vice versa. I will say for folks that are in Wyoming, Wyoming is actually a Go Open state. Not sure you knew that, but I've had the chance to work with Laurel Ballard and other folks at the Wyoming Department of Education to talk about increasing their OER work, as well as providing a repository to even find the resources. And so Wyoming has a hub on OER Commons, if you are not aware of that. But I can also connect you with some of the state level folks to help kind of elevate this work that's happening in Wyoming. Christy, thank you for saying that. Wyoming has been sporadic on providing info. Okay, that's good to know. Karen, I wish you luck on starting that conversation. Okay, I'm going to move on now. And I do want to preface by saying, fortunately, I've been a part of several webinars over the past few months and was able to leverage an open license to revise and remix their content. And so the content that we're going to see moving forward here is actually pulled from several other presentations, and I want to make sure that I attribute to the original creators. And so funding OER creation in these next few slides is actually from Anthony Gabriel in Garnet Valley and Centennial Public Schools in Pennsylvania. This is his first year at Centennial, and they were not doing anything with OER. And he had helped launch all of the work that was happening in Garnet Valley. We lift them up in several reports, and I'm happy to share the links to those reports where you can see what Garnet Valley was able to do. But the first thing that they decided was to look at how they were even procuring their curriculum. And it was on a 5-year cycle. And they had folks that would come together, the teachers that would come together to kind of unpack the new materials that they would get and develop lessons and resources around that. And what happened was that it would go into a binder and then be kind of shared with their school district, but no one would actually use it. And so they were spending a lot of money on not only the textbooks and the instructional materials that they would purchase, but then bringing the teachers together to do this work for the work to not actually be used. And so they decided that they were spending a lot of money on that, but they also were losing a lot of students in the state of Pennsylvania to cyber charter schools. And so the curriculum director, Sam, approached Anthony Gabriel, who was in charge of learning innovation, I believe was his title, and said, what are some options that we have and what can that look like? And so they decided to look into OER, and that was around the time that I had joined the department, and Anthony reached out to me and said, where do we get started in all of this? And so they really started with Jay McTie's work on UDL, and then they also reached out to Grant Wiggins at the time and started on UBD, Understanding by Design, and that is how they developed their content. So then the way that they were able to grow that was paying the teachers to come together as a team to develop that content. And it started with one course, and then they scaled up from there. And you can see some of the actual numbers as far as how much they were able to kind of reallocate the funds that they would have traditionally spent on the textbooks back into the teachers and the school. They were doing it. And so it started with Understanding by Design, also universal designs and learning, and understanding how to make materials accessible. And then they learned more about copyright, fair use, and Creative Commons, and building in OER as part of that. They also received professional development and instructional design because they realized when they started to make blended courses and online courses, it was not simply digitizing a face-to-face interaction. And so they needed to have an actual instructional designer come in and lead them in some of that work. And then their total course cost was about $15,000 compared to what they were spending on their materials beforehand. They're also, I want to go back to this word up here as far as the heading here. Iteration was their biggest kind of goal in all of this, is that they had someone that was helping review for those broken links on an often basis. And I think they were doing that on a monthly basis. I know North Kansas City Public Schools created a specific email address so that when teachers were using the resources and they found a broken link, they found something that just kind of floundered in the classroom, they could quickly send feedback right away. And then when they met on a monthly or a quarterly basis, they would go back and review the feedback that they'd received in that email address. And it's a simple addition that helps provide that feedback loop and then be able to iterate on. So Garnet Valley and Centennial, you can see the reallocation of funds, how much they were spending on textbooks in 2015 and 16. And then that significantly decreases by 2017 and 18. And then they had to spend a little bit more in 2018 and 19 and this year, because they had specific electives and AP courses that the teachers did not feel comfortable using OER in that, and so they needed to purchase some textbooks. However, the overall total number spent on textbooks significantly decreased, and then they were able to provide on-demand professional learning and making sure that people felt comfortable and confident in the development of all of these resources. So that is from Anthony Gabriel in Pennsylvania. And then this next part is coming from the state level from Barbara Suits in Washington State, at their Office of OSPI. I forget what the S stands for, Public Instruction. I know that part. But Barbara has actually been doing OER work since 2012. And so she has been an incredible mentor in all of this work, because the Washington legislature appropriated money to the development of OER in 2012, and they needed someone to lead all of this work and coordinate. And so the following slides are from her and her perspective at the state level in leading this. So the spectrum of OER creation, they really approached this from a number of ways and a number of entry points, and that was adapting existing OER so that it could be supplemental to the current resources that districts had in place. They wanted to curate collections, and then they put that into an OER Commons hub. Then they also developed homegrown lessons, and I'll show you an example of what that might look like in just a moment. They adapted their core instructional materials to be more inclusive and representative of Indigenous peoples in the state of Washington, which has been really great. And then they also had money appropriated from the legislature to provide grants for districts that were interested in creating their own course materials. So internally, they were able to work with the Native office within the Department of Education, and they created this full course curriculum for for early childhood. It does include early childhood now, elementary, middle school, and high school. And it is called Time Immemorial. It's tribal sovereignty in Washington state. So they are able to develop this full curriculum with OSPI's Office of Native Education. And they worked with over 29 tribes in the state of Washington to make sure that their materials were accurately representing the peoples of Washington. It was a really cool project to watch as it was developed, and then made available to anyone and everyone, because the state of Washington has an open license requirement on all of the things that are created at the state level. So this is available to anyone so that you can learn more about Indigenous folks in the state of Washington, but you can also see how they were able to create it and potentially get an idea of how this might be replicated in South Dakota, North Dakota, and Wyoming. They also worked with external partners, and this is something that I do a lot in connecting with nonprofits and different organizations that provide educational materials, such as the Smithsonian and even the Tenement Museum in New York City. They have wonderful educational resources that they provide, and sometimes it starts with a conversation. Do you know that you can make your resources available with an open license? Well, what does that mean? And so that is exactly what the state of Washington did with the League of Women Voters of Washington. They have this guide, or this really comprehensive resource for the state we're in when you're learning about Washington history in 4th grade and in 8th grade. And they asked them if they'd be willing to change the copyright on that from making it free but copyrighted to an open license, so that it would be free and open licensed, and of course then remixable and all of that. So that is another way of kind of leveraging some policy and the open license to work with other folks. Then, as I mentioned, they had appropriation to be able to provide grants for districts that were interested in this work. And so, as I mentioned, all resources, that are produced by Washington have to be openly licensed. And so any sort of derivatives of that are then openly licensed as well. So this is 1st grade life science storyline to support the new plants kit. They also have 4th grade history, but this has all been created by their different grantees. And so districts in the state of Washington have been able to apply for these grants and create resources. So they receive actual funding from the state to support all of this work. This is what they have been working on most recently, is social studies content development. in Washington State. And so they have a district team, they have a team from across the state in a variety of roles, teachers and librarians and district leaders that are coming together to develop social studies content. And they also open license all of that, which has been really great to see the development of that. They have received more funding and more legislation kind of support. So just know that it started in 2012, but they continue to get that. I know that North Dakota in particular has support for OER. It's just at the higher ed level right now. And I work really closely with someone that's in North Dakota, Tanya Spilavoy, who helps support all of the legislation that's happened for OER in higher ed, but we've been talking more and more about how we can increase support for K-12 as well. So that is just something to kind of put on your radar. Once again, I'm going to have you join me in the chat. Coordination of OER development can be all of these different opportunities. You saw that this was coming from the state level, but you also saw Anthony's coordination at the district level. So how might you be able to support coordination of OER development? Yes, Sarah, create awareness. Yes, yes, yes. That is what a lot of my work is around. Talking about it. Yep, absolutely. Janet, changing mindsets from textbooks is so hard. I'm happy to help however I can. Yes, spark interest, absolutely. Be a resource for others to help find, absolutely. Oh, Laura, that makes me so sad to hear that. I'd love to keep talking to you about that, how we can help kind of move into that growth mindset and looking at different options. Karen, yes, work with that curriculum director. Christy, yeah, you know, sometimes that happens too, and then we're forced into it. Can be a good thing and can be a bad thing. So, yep. Yes, your name on here says C. Redding. I don't know what your first name is, and I'm so sorry. But yes, working at the state library level, and if there's anyone that I can help, Carmen, thank you. If there's anyone that I can help introduce you to, like I said, Tanya would be wonderful to work with, especially because she's in North Dakota. She's been working at the higher ed level, but she was the one that helped get that bill in North Dakota passed and that got that in, you know, on people's radar. So yes, 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 yes. Oh, great. Okay. And I would love to have a conversation with you. Okay. Anyone else want to add a comment in here? Building awareness is huge. And sometimes it really does start with pointing people to resources. If you know of a specific unit or lesson that they're working on and being able to offer them options, we know that that is one very specific entry point, but it can change people's directions so that they might go to OER Commons first instead of going to Teachers Pay Teachers. That is a huge win. So just know that while it may seem very, very small at the time, that is a huge win. And add it up. Like, just let it keep building, because I promise that it matters. All of these things, these small steps matter a lot. Okay, let's talk about culturally responsive OER. I think it's important for us to recognize where we are in the country right now. I wanted to start with that earlier, but it also lends itself to, I think, this next part of the conversation. I just left DC, where I've been for the past 4 years. I joined the protests last week. Culturally responsive instructional materials, I think, matter even more right now, so that they are inclusive and representative of our student population, whether that is Black, Indigenous, people of color. We have to get outside of the traditional Eurocentric, singular narrative that most instructional materials present. 2 weeks ago, it was the 99th anniversary of the Tulsa Race Massacre. I didn't know about that until 2 years ago, because it was not something that was presented to me in any of my K-12 content or even higher level content. So I think it's really important for us to think about how we can start to bring in primary sources, as well as developing culturally responsive resources that are inclusive and representative of our students. We currently have 50.8 million students in our pre-K-12 public education system. That is data from the National Center on Educational Statistics this year. Our students of color are actually the majority at 27.1 million. That may look different in your states. That may be more indigenous rather than people of color or Black students in particular. But we know our instructional materials are not reflective of our students. Dr. Brudine Sims Bishop talked about this in 1990 with Windows and Mirrors. How are we allowing the instructional materials or the classroom libraries or even the library collections to be windows for students to see the lives of others and the cultures of others, as well as mirrors of themselves? Do our Indigenous students see themselves in our content? Most often not. So OER and an open license allows us to customize materials in simple things like names of students. We know the majority of our materials are written, again, from a white perspective. And so when we talk about Johnny and Sally, those are white names. We also recognize the option of having non-binary pronouns, and that they, them, and theirs are widely accepted and are starting to be more accepted in K-12 systems. Not always, but not necessarily always referring to boys and girls and the binary, and introducing y'all or folks, which is one of my favorite words, and just identities in general, culture and language, and bringing that in. We recognize that we need to do more and we need to do better in all of this. And so I think it's really important to talk about this when we talk about open educational resources. My former colleague, current colleague, I don't know, I'm still technically working with New America in some capacity, but Jenny Muniz has become a leading expert on culturally responsive teaching. She put out a report in March of 2019 where she did a statewide scan of all 50 states in their teaching credentials and their teaching standards on if the state required teachers to understand culturally responsive teaching. So she was able to identify 8 competencies that were either reflected in the state standards or were not reflected in the state standards, and what they could potentially look for in state standards and state teaching standards to be more culturally responsive, and why it's so important. And it starts by doing personal work. And you might have read about this more recently in that with anti-racism work, that it does start with our personal biases and our own upbringings, and recognizing what that means for the way that we live and the way that we teach and the way that we talk to one another. But then really tapping into our students' experiences as well. So how are we bringing in their experiences? How are we connecting those dots? How are we working with their families to also understand that it's not just them sending their child to our classrooms, but that the whole family is really involved in the learning. She was able to identify 6 different ways, and this is a presentation that she just gave back in April, and we started to bring her into some of our OER work because we thought that there were some natural connections. And so she had these 6 different things that she identified as far as comprehensive, inclusive environments, engagement, cultural competence, role models, critical thinking and problem solving, and how we can use materials in all of this. And so it really starts with our engagement. And culturally responsive teachers connect the concepts to everyday lives. And that is really important for us when we're thinking about the materials that we're bringing in. When we start to make those natural connections, we see an increased engagement in students, which will ultimately impact achievement and growth. And there is actual research that shows that this happens. We also know that it is important to bring in that culturally relevant kind of classroom in that scenario so that we are adapting as events unfold. If I were still in the classroom right now, you can guarantee that I would be talking about what's happening right now, because it is impacting our students, and especially if we have students of color. And so the two examples that she used in this in particular were ways that students could apply concepts that they were working on into their classroom and into possible projects even. So students in LA use traffic stop data to understand racial profiling in their community, but that also helped them understand certain math concepts because they were able to review data and then map out where these things were happening in their community and have math talk and like math conversations. Students in New York also participated in a Socratic seminar about stop and frisk policies. So these are all really important pieces when we're talking about making those connections and connecting what our students are experiencing in the classroom. Something that I learned from Jenny in all of this is if we really think about it, all of our curriculum or all of the resources that we're bringing in, they are cultural in some way, shape, or form. Whether that is the white culture or the white perspective that we are bringing in, which is cultural practices or languages or celebrations. That could be Columbus Day, talking about that, and that being a very white kind of affirming holiday and what that might mean for people of color. But that some are represented better than others. And again, we know that that is pretty common. And so how can we start to engage with our students as well as our families in this to bring in their culture and let them know that they matter? This is also important to note that students are exposed to stereotypes in all of this. So if I think back to my own experience in 11th grade US history, you start US history at a certain time, and then you get towards the end of the school year and you're like maybe only in the 1960s and you can't get in all of the content. So how are stereotypes being reinforced in a lot of the materials that we currently have, and how could we possibly change that? It wasn't until recently that I discovered, the majority of the content that was in my classroom library was actually, it was a very specific narrative that was being perpetuated. And if there were certain stereotypes that they were being exposed to, it was clearly done implicitly and without my knowledge. And I recognize now that I could have done better when I was in the classroom. And recognizing that we also want to bring in books that have different perspectives, but not always talking about certain points of history. So what I'm trying to say is we don't want to always continue the narrative of Black people being about slavery and the civil rights movement. There is also more to Black students or Black people than those certain kind of events. And so we want to bring in more resources to be more comprehensive in that. Cultural competence is the ability to understand, communicate, and interact with people across cultures. And so it is really important to think about that windows and mirrors that I referred to by Rudine Sims Bishop and her work there. How can we give those opportunities through more children's literature and getting outside of the traditional canon? I recently read Stamped, the new YA novel, which was a remake of Stamped from the Beginning by Dr. Kendi, but done by Jason Reynolds, who is an incredible young adult author. And that should be used in middle schools right now. I firmly believe that. So how can we provide more of those windows and mirrors so that there is more comprehensive kind of narrative that is being presented to students? Jenny has actually created a reflection guide for culturally responsive curricula, and I'm happy to share the resource with you separately because it might be a little difficult to see what some of the small font is in here. But she was able to break down questions that we can ask ourselves when we're looking at curriculum in general or materials in general or library books. And so they are broken down into the following questions. And I think it's really important that we kind of, I'm going to read them. Sorry, please forgive me for just reading these to you, but I think it's really important to talk about. So do our resources portray diversity in terms of ethnicity, race, culture, gender, ability, nationality, socioeconomic status, and sexual orientation, etc.? Do resources make connections to student and community experiences, strengths, talents, and funds of knowledge? Again, making the Black experience more than slavery and the civil rights era. There's more to the Black experience than that. Are resources authored by and include the perspectives of historically underrepresented students and communities? Think of our Indigenous folks right now. They're not represented in the majority of our instructional materials. And so how can we make sure that we're including more resources authored by different tribes and maybe even translated into English from traditional languages? Do resources challenge preconceived ideas about which students and groups can be mathematicians, scientists, engineers, authors, etc.? Jenny did an activity with folks where she asked them to name 10 scientists and then had us calculate how many were women and how many were people of color in that list. It was really eye-opening to think about that. The collection of jobs books that I had in my classroom library were traditional types of jobs, and how that continued to perpetuate certain ideas of who could be what. Then we have the last three questions. Do resources acknowledge the contributions of historically underrepresented people and communities to various content areas? Do resources connect learning to the real world issues students care about within their schools, communities, and the larger society? Of course, that being very relevant right now. Do resources call on students to take action to affect change within their schools, communities, and the larger society? I'm going to pop up the chat window. It looks like some folks are signing in. Oh, okay, good. Stamped. Oh, I'm so glad that you all know that. Okay, good. That makes me really happy. Highly recommend it. I seriously, I learned so much. And I was like, oh, why did I not know any of this stuff? Okay. So I have another question for you. This is a 6th grade science lesson from Broken Arrow Public Schools just outside of Tulsa, Oklahoma. And it's their middle school science curriculum. Here is one piece of openly licensed content. How could this lesson potentially be revised and remixed to better address culturally responsive teaching? Now, it's hard to tell from just this single page here, but what is something that could be done to make that more culturally responsive? If you have an idea, throw it in the chat. No ideas? Okay, that's cool. Let's talk about that then. Culturally responsive. How could we, oh yes, and mention author of culturally responsive teaching. So that would be Jenny Muniz, my colleague at New America. But then she's done a lot of work with Zaretta Hammond, as well as Gladson Billings, and I'm forgetting her first name, but I'm happy to reference those. She also has a list of resources for educators wanting to learn more about culturally responsive teaching. So I'll make sure that that is included in the links for you so that you have that to refer to later. So thinking about this and ecosystems in particular, our ecosystems are pretty much like standardized as far as what we consider a different ecosystem, but this would look different implemented in certain states, of course, and in even certain parts of the country. So how can we tap into what a student may know in their kind of local sphere of influence to talk about ecosystems? That's a very small and simple way to make something more culturally responsive by asking them to talk about what they see in their community and what role that plays in ecosystems. So that's one very small example on that. Oops, and I just exited out and oh, it tried to take me to the real thing. Sorry. Let me go back. Maybe. Now it doesn't want to let me go back to my slide. Why is this happening? Okay, I'm gonna stop share. Let me try this again. Oh, and it just wanted to refresh the whole thing. Okay, I have a couple more examples, sorry, for making resources culture responsive. So I just wanted to show those before we kind of open it up for a Q&A. And now it's just wanting to really spend its time loading. Thank you, free Hilton Wi-Fi. Okay, here we go. Maybe, there we go. Something else is to think about recognizing the contributions to specific industries or specific sectors by underrepresented people and communities. So I didn't know anything about Wangari Maathai. And this is, she spent the majority of her life talking about ecology, and she is an ecologist, but specifically in Kenya, and what her contributions to ecology were. And so recognizing even something like that, and different underrepresented people and communities. Connecting students to their own experiences and real world experiences. This may not be applicable to North Dakota, South Dakota, and Wyoming necessarily, but thinking about what biodiversity looks like in urban settings compared to suburban or rural settings. And so if you had content where you are studying certain topics like biodiversity, how could you then have students explore what biodiversity looks like in their community and bring that to the classroom? So it's engaging them in being able to take their learning and applying that to their communities. Connecting content to real world issues and taking action. This is Stanford's curriculum called SCALE, and this is developed for science content, and so it is aligned to NGSS, and those are next gen science standards. And they have the, I forget what the 3E that are involved with NGSS. And so they have kids that are being scientists. But what I love about this is that they were very cognizant of making sure that they weren't just presenting kind of normal science information, but they were really trying to make it relevant and timely and tapping into real world issues that are happening right now. So they do address climate change, and they do address certain things that are happening, again, real world right now, which is really important. Okay, that's as far as my presentation I have, and I would love to hear some thoughts and questions that you may have.
So Kristina, I have been adding, as you've been chatting and mentioning things, I've been adding those links to the agenda under your name. So I mean, you'll want to look at that and double check, make sure you do everything. But I have been adding just so they're there.
I appreciate it.
This has been amazing. Thank you.
Of course.
You know, in South Dakota and North Dakota, I know we have the OSEUs, and I don't remember, what are they called in North Dakota, Carmen? Do you remember? I know, I'm putting you on the spot. I'm sorry.
They're the educational service agencies. They may be called BOCES or ESAs or AEAs.
The OSE. They're the essential understandings. In South Dakota, we have the essential understandings.
Okay. Okay.
And so we have the essential understandings in South Dakota. And I know North Dakota is working on them too. And so in the chat, I just dropped the essential understandings for South Dakota.
Great.
And so, I mean, like in our states, I know there is a number of resources that we can really use to address the Native American populations.
Absolutely.
You know, that are freely available, and to kind of help include those. And there's been a lot of work in South Dakota to do that work. There's also quite a bit of work in North Dakota. And can Wyoming speak to, do you know if you're doing stuff? All right.
That's a question we can check with Paige when
when she comes tomorrow. All right, so we have Kristina, you guys, for another about 10 minutes. So, and, you know, and then she'll be back on the road again. So tell us what kind of questions you have. I mean, because we looked at a lot of things. I mean, we
Yeah.
you covered a lot of stuff.
Yes.
And but I'm glad. I mean, these are all the things like that sustainability, and how do we get that sustainability built in?
Absolutely.
And the review process. Do you
Mhm.
have examples of more? I mean, so like you've talked about like there's monthly reviews and things like
Yep.
that.
Yep.
Is there a report that's written on like a concrete like what they've done? I mean, because I make these same recommendations as you, like, oh, we should
Yep.
review this every month, but in
Yep.
practice it's not that easy. And so like I
Yeah.
worked with a school district in South Dakota where they did science, and it was elementary. It was really
Okay.
cool. They did it, they made the news, and their superintendent at the time was like, we're doing this because as a district, we've chosen to invest in our teachers and
Yeah.
provide them the PD, and we're a
Yeah.
one-to-one school. And, I mean,
Yep.
and now we can have science that's aligned to the new South Dakota standards. I mean,
Yeah.
so there's all these really good things. But in terms of like review, we did set up a process for them to say,
Great.
okay, when every, and I don't, it was like every time you finish a unit, you
Mhm.
guys are going to take your team time that week or whatever it was to,
Yeah.
to, do this work, this didn't, and just kind of, and so then it's ready to roll for next year.
Yeah.
But I think that is really, really hard.
Yeah.
And so to get that in. Oh, and Jen has a
Yeah.
really excellent question in the chat too
I
about
see that.
the research based.
Yeah.
You go, Kristina.
Yeah. So this is a tough question to answer when it comes to these types of resources, and it's a very valid question. The most of the time I will say start with ed reports, and I look for like the comprehensive curriculum that exists happens to be OER. The reason I say that I start there is because it may be easier for particularly curriculum directors who have traditionally procured textbook series and know that process really, really well, for them to visit ed reports and even look at the current textbook series that exists in the school system and see what it's reviewed. And then look at other OER, like comprehensive OER that they've reviewed, and kind of compare. And that is one way to start there, because you can see that it's been, their research and their review process has been really helpful. More of the kind of, I don't want to say ad hoc, but more of the curated units of study are not going to be research based, but it does open up for a conversation to say, what are we using in our schools right now? And let's look at what, if they have been reviewed by ed reports or the Department of Louisiana, Louisiana Department of Education, and their instructional materials review is another resource that I point people to. Because even if we have that core content in our classrooms, we know that teachers are going to Pinterest and TPT and other places to supplement. And my question has always been, how do you know that that is good content that they're using, that they're pulling down from the website? And that, for some reason, OER has always been more critically like examined. And I'm like, but we supplement stuff all the time. Like, I used to pull in stuff all the time, and you never question that because I'm a professional and this is what I do. And I can't say that to everyone, but trust me, if you need me, I got you. And I'm happy to ask your superintendent that question or your curriculum director that question, because I mean, Jeanette Westfall, who has been an incredible resource and kind of leader in all of this work, she is the assistant superintendent in Liberty Public Schools just outside of Kansas City. And they've been doing OER work since 2015. They had 0 courses that had OER, and now they have over 60. And she will be the first person that will ask that question in response. And she's like, here you go. Here is the same thing. Like, why are we always so much more critical of open than we are of any other type of resource? And how do you know the resources that your teachers are pulling down in any other way, shape, or form are also high quality? So that is always my question back. I did do a webinar on OERs and copyright through American University. Yes, we have a whole series actually. Yeah, I see you shaking your head. Thanks for joining. That means a lot. You know what? We signed up to do that series when we realized that everyone was freaking out about doing read alouds. And I love read alouds. And I used to lead a lot of copyright trainings in the state of Nebraska. And I presented some wrong information. And I feel like sometimes I want to go back and apologize to people and be like, I'm really sorry. I've learned otherwise now. But fair use can be leveraged a lot more than we think. I usually still like to err on the side of caution when it comes to this. And but we did this whole series on best practices in fair use, and particularly for open education. So I just dropped the link in there to the entire series that we did. It started at the end of March with read alouds, and knowing that that is considered fair use, and not even just right now during crisis distance learning, but beyond that. And then we got into essential copyright knowledge, as well as developing content, and like finding content and then developing content. We did one on universal design. So we had folks that had been in the field for a number of years and talked about what it means to make materials accessible and born accessible. And then our second to last one that we did on the 22nd was working towards anti-racism and culturally responsive teaching and open education. And that one was incredible. I learned so much from the presenters on there, and I just get to provide like the teacher experience as well as kind of someone in the OER work. And so don't worry about like me in there at all, but the panelists I recommend just listening to, because they were amazing. There is one, it was supposed to be last Friday and they rescheduled. And so this Friday is going to be using open licensing to support LGBTQ inclusive learning. And that's my colleague and dear friend, Sabia Prescott, that will be leading that with an amazing panel again. So I'm so glad that you watched that. Thanks. Any other questions or thoughts? You all are so nice and quiet. I feel like I'm talking to myself here.
You know, we've all been so webinar trained that
I understand that as well. Shelley, you're right. It is a lot of food for thought. It's a lot of information. So I totally respect that.
All right. Well, if you guys don't have any more questions, we will do a quick applause for Kristina.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate you taking time off out of your trip and getting to hang out. It's so good to get to hang out with you, and I always learn so much.
I love it.
So
thank you. I appreciate that. You all have the link to the slides. I have made that open. So if you want to use that for your own PD or whatever, please feel free to do so. And my contact information is on there as well. But I'm happy to have conversations with any of you.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Oh,
Kristina.
Christy, you asked which one should you look at, the stamped. So if you want to dig in hardcore, over 500 pages is stamped from the beginning, which is the original one from Dr. Ibram X. Kendi. The new one with Jason Reynolds was adapted for YA, and that one, an audiobook, was like under 5 hours. And so I highly recommend it and learned so much.
Great. And the original is free to listen to on Spotify right now. So
yes.
And I did link that. I linked that, and I also linked the Jason Reynolds book in. I just added your webinar series in, and so I'll send you what I added, and then you can hey, you missed, and we can get those added. So
okay. That's great.
Well,
Thank you all so much.
If you come to Rapid, I will socially distance.
I will be happy to let you know.
All right. All right. Take care.
Thank you all for the work that you do. Keep.